From ancient times, the four Gospels were associated in manuscripts and in tradition with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the words that are considered part of the Gospels themselves don't identify the authors of the Gospels, and the Bible does not give us the list of books that are in the Bible. Those facts are learned and/or confirmed from extra-biblical sources, namely the Apostolic tradition, the Fathers of the Church, and the Catholic Church's teaching. As Protestant scholar Michael Kruger admitted, the early tradition and the testimony of the Church Fathers is a crucial component in identifying and confirming the authorship of the Gospels.
In the Gospels themselves, they're what we call formally anonymous. What that means is in the text itself, it doesn't say John wrote this or Matthew wrote this. Now, should that be a concern? Well, actually not. When we think about ancient biographies often were formally anonymous. So the Gospels, leaving the names of the author outside the text formally, is not at all unusual. So then how do you know who wrote these books? Well, several ways that we conclude that the authors that wrote them are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it's simply this. First, the titles of the books. Our earliest manuscripts of these Gospel texts all have the titles attached to them, and we can see them. So as far back as we can see, these Gospels had the titles with them. But moreover, one has to ask the question, if these titles were a late addition, how is it that we have such uniformity in what these documents were called? If Matthew's Gospel, for example, wasn't called Matthew's Gospel until late in the 2nd century, then why don't we have a number of copies of Matthew's Gospels with different titles, with different names? In fact, we don't possess that. What we find is incredible uniformity across the board of the titles of these Gospels. Matthew's Gospel is called Matthew, Mark's is called Mark's. It's amazingly consistent, something we would not expect if the titles were added later. There's actually more evidence than that for why we know the Gospels are written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that is we have very strong patristic testimony in this regard. Papias, who was an early church bishop in the early 2nd century, tells us and confirms for us that Matthew was the author of Matthew and Mark was the author of Mark. Papias was said to have heard the Gospel of John preach. If so, then he's only one step removed from the apostles themselves. Also, church father by the name of Irenaeus in the late 2nd century tells us that these four Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Where would Irenaeus have gotten his information from? Well, we're told in the other early Christian writings that Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of John the Apostle himself. So whatever Irenaeus tells us about the authors of the Gospels, most likely he got that from Polycarp, who got that from the Apostle John. That is a very reliable historical sequence. There are very good reasons to think that Irenaeus knows better who the Gospel authors are than modern scholars.
Such facts demolish the utterly illogical Protestant heresy of sola scriptura, a heresy that is directly contrary to the Bible's teaching. See, for example, 2 Thessalonians 2:15, among other verses. Apostolic tradition is inextricably connected to the identification and the use of the Scriptures. Thus, the inconsistency and foolishness of Anderson is on display when he proclaims that the Bible is his sole authority, while he simultaneously relies, whether he realizes it or not, on extra-biblical sources and the Catholic Church's tradition to determine which books are in the New Testament and who wrote the books. No true Christian in history ever believed what Anderson does, which is why Anderson attacks the entire history of the Christian Church. Further, while Anderson attacks the Council of Nicaea, he might not even claim to believe in the Trinity today if it had not been for what happened there. As a demonic heretic who hates Jesus Christ and his church, Anderson follows the devil in attacking and mocking the fathers of the Christian church, its saints, and the Christian church's patrimony.
So they all get together and agree at this ecumenical council, and they come out with the Nicene Creed of, hey, this is what we all believe as Christians. Think about getting a bunch of phony preachers together. I would never go to such a thing. Neither would any Bible-believing Christian. Neither did any Bible-believing Christian. Pastor Anderson, you're ignorant of church history. You need to read the church fathers. You need to read Polycarp. You need to read Clement of Rome. You need to read the church fathers.
Yes, the pagan Anderson, who, as we've seen, utterly rejects the person of Jesus Christ, totally perverts Scripture, and worships the Bible as God, mocks the Church of Jesus Christ because he hates Christ and he rejects the true Christian faith. In his foolishness, he fails to recognize that he simultaneously relies on the Catholic Church, its apostolic tradition, and the fathers of the Church to identify the authors of New Testament books and to determine which books are part of the New Testament canon.